Can't. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the session. Feel free to be on or off camera, whatever you're comfortable with. We'll just give it another few seconds or so to let folks in. All right, we'll get started here. So thanks for joining us today. I'm Adam Hertel. I'm a board member of Naturally San Diego. Appreciate everyone jumping in today on this, I think, very eventful, relevant topic, especially with a lot of the things that are always going on in the industry, but especially now with some recent changes being announced from a big distributor. Just want to give a quick kind of highlight call out of Naturally San Diego. For those of you who are not familiar, we are a very fast-growing group of brand advocates, really here to serve first and foremost as our North Star, our emerging brand community here in San Diego and Southern Orange County as well. Events like this that are done digitally obviously are great because it opens it up to having subject matter experts like Tanae and Greg from Floret, as well as other members from around the country who can join. So quick plug for those of you who have not signed up yet, next week, April 25th, is our biggest event of the year, our Naturally San Diego Pitch Slam, to be held at Liberty Station in San Diego. Would love to see you all there. Tickets are selling fast, so please register for that and hope you can join us if you have not yet. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started introducing our experts today from Floret. Floret is a trade management software solution platform that's probably been around for a couple of years now and is also rapidly growing. And I think the opportunity today, coming off of a lot of what we hear from brands, is what topics are of interest and relevant. We're always wanting to add value for brands in the scheme of how to work with distributors and in the market as you're growing, and also how to preserve cash flow really critically. So Tanae and Greg both offer a great perspective and expertise in this area from Floret. This is not a sales pitch by any means. It's much more just to do an all-around educational opportunity for you, and looking at how you can work with trade management at UNFI, KE, other various distributors that you work with. I think in the interest of all the topics we're going to cover on the agenda today, we'll just ask to save questions to the end. We will allow for 10-15 minutes at the end of the meeting for questions. It's a lot to get through in an hour. We'll do our best to move quickly, and certainly we can run a few minutes over for those of you who can stay. Today we'll be doing a quick demo to kind of show how trade management and the platform rolls up. Again, just to kind of give you high level, we're not going to do a specific demo or share any brand information on case studies, but just more overall view. And I think with that, I will just jump in and let both Greg and Tanae do a quick introduction of themselves, and then we'll get into it. So Tanae, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Yeah. Thanks for teeing that up, Adam, and great to be, sharing some insights on deductions and trade spend with all of you. My name is Tanae. I'm the founder of Floret. As Adam mentioned, software solution helping brands manage trade spend. We've worked with brands as small as a couple $100,000 revenue, all the way up to 9 figures. So really, the intention here is for us to try to be a resource to support brands as they manage this really critical piece of their business. And one of the people that's really helped us do that over the past year is our head of business development, Greg.
Hey guys, Greg Esslinger here. Thanks, Adam, for having us on. Excited to chat deductions with everybody and trade spend. My background is I spent about a decade in the lion's den over at UNFI. So that's kind of what I've built my business on. For the last 5 years. After I left, I went and started Natural Food Ally, where I've been helping brands on UNFI specific issues. And of course, what comes up the most is deductions and trade spend. And that's when I, about a year and a half ago, got involved with Tanae, and we started to work on Floret together, and excited to chat more.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Cool. So we'll jump in and kind of, I think, use like a bit of a funnel approach here, starting high level, maybe some information that a lot of you are familiar with, but if not, we just don't want to take anything for granted. And then we'll start to get into some more specifics as we go through. So just to tee it off high level, Tanae or Greg, to either one of you, can you just kind of, for the the whole audience define the definition, like 101 table stakes. When we talk about trade spend, what is trade spend high level? And then more specifically, deductions, chargebacks, using either terminology, how does that roll in? And what's the difference between the two, and kind of prioritizing the order of those?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, go for it, Greg.
Yeah. So deductions are essentially, trade spend is everything from MCB scans, promotions, all the spend that you end up doing to promote your product, right? And deductions essentially are when you get chargebacks. Usually, what happens is the distributor will deduct directly from your invoice. Some deductions act as kind of a profit center for the distributors, while others are just basically passed through when the distributor is acting as a clearinghouse for the retailer. Most are just commitments a brand made to the distributor or retailer, and it's just kind of being collected upon. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll add a little color there too, which is just on the trade spend part, you have trade spend that maybe you would have agreed to and budgeted for. We see a lot of brands that we work with that are very successful come in with a set of allocated idea.
One fucking thing at a time in my life. It's fucking crazy.
Okay, someone might not be on mute.
I think they just did. Perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, building on that, actually, right? Brands have to do a lot of things at a time, and one of them is manage trade spend. And so they might set a budget at the beginning of the year for how much money they expect to spend, just as a matter of course of doing business with different retailers and distributors. You have a set of obligations that you will have agreed to contractually, in terms with each of the retailers and distributors, and then there's sort of discretionary trade spend built on top of that. And where deductions really come in is they're a way of actually actualizing all of that trade spend off of all the revenue that you do with these partners.
Excellent. Thanks tonight for that build. I guess flowing right into that then, that's a great setup for the stigma of chargebacks or deductions. We kind of use those terms interchangeably, same thing essentially. But I guess, Greg, maybe back to you, fact versus fiction with your background. I think the supplier community, oftentimes there's a running joke on this is like malicious, intentional stuff. This is obviously kind of like the taboo subject in many ways of the industry, where it feels like distributors are specifically, picking on small brands or looking at these as very intentional profit centers, sometimes maybe even to a point of deceit or theft in terms of the maliciousness at which these deductions are derived. Obviously, that's not always the case. It might be the case in rare scenarios, but give us your view on, what is the role? How do distributors view these in terms of being a deliberate part of their model versus, hey, this is what you signed up for. You signed the contracts. You're all aware that these are our policies, and kind of looking at, right, wrong, or indifferent on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the distributors, they do use it as a profit center. It's true that that's, part of their business model is to make extra money off of these deductions. That said, every brand gets the contract when they start doing business with the distributors, and it spells out almost everything in those contracts, in those policies, that they're going to be charged back for. So a lot of it, brands get involved with these distributors, and they're excited about, starting to work with them, and, they're not really looking that closely to the contracts. Is what happens a lot of the time. Brands need to have an expert with them, looking at them, getting it explained down to every little detail, so that they can understand everything they're going to get hit with. But the reality is, yes, there are some deductions, for example, an MCB chargeback that there's going to be a markup there, and you're not getting charged back. This is one of the most common things I see, is that brands don't understand that there's going to be a markup on these chargebacks. And say you do free fill, it's not going to be charged back at the cost of the the product to the retailer is going to be charged back at say a published wholesale or a markup, depending on which distributor you're working with. And so a lot of times brands, they don't get their first check for months on months on months, and they don't realize they're in a negative balance because these chargebacks hit so hard. And brands, they're scared. I mean, a lot of brands are scared to dispute deductions. They don't realize that it's fully expected of them to dispute anything they don't think is legitimate. But a brand going in that doesn't have that experience or have somebody that knows what they're doing or dealing with will be very at times they're not sure where they can push back, how to push back, where they have leverage and where they don't. So yeah, it's definitely a rough stigma around the industry, but the reality is that they're not going to go anywhere. These chargebacks are there to stay. As long as you put the time into understanding them, you can and stay organized. You can at least plan for them, and sometimes have to plan for the unexpected and make sure you actually are disputing them.
Excellent. Before we jump into kind of one of UNFI's new policies, guys, with SSA, which I think is probably a topic on the minds of a lot of the group, can you just high level describe where the majority of these chargebacks are classified? Are there patterns that you typically see with your clients in general, like, hey, it's in certain areas, are there abuses on MCBs that brands didn't sign up for and all of a sudden they're being billed back? Is it more service penalty things through the logistics supply chain that potentially are shorts or late penalties? Maybe it just depends on the category and the brand, but any commentary there with what you're seeing recently, kind of the major offenders?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, it's across the gamut. I mean, I think probably the biggest area of chargebacks that you don't feel are legitimate are the shortages. Most brands see this where they've shipped a PO, right, and it's shipped in full by your warehouse, by your co-packer, whoever's doing it, and then all of a sudden they get a charge back for a third of the load, saying that it only had 2 pallets when it's supposed to have 4 or supposed to have 3 or whatever it is. And as long as you have that signed BOL, you can push back on it. But what happens internally at these distributors is they're picking these up from one warehouse across the country. It's moving through 4 or 5 different warehouses to get to the end warehouse, and they get lost. And then they find them in some other warehouse. They receive them in on a different PO number. So there are charge deductions like that are very common and are pretty easy to push back on. And then there's other stuff. I mean, slotting is one of the biggest ones I see, that brands agree on the contract to a blanket free fill for new retailers the distributor gets you into, or the distributor starts selling to. And they'll go ahead and take that free fill for any new retailer, whether or not they really helps you get into there or not. And they might not even pass that free fill on. They just they could pocket that money. So there's situations like that where it's just, if you can make sure you fill out the forms right initially, or push back on the contracts initially, you can avoid those sort of pitfalls. But I don't know, Tanae, if you can think of any other really common ones that come up.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good overview of the largest ones. I mean, cash discounts are really common as well. The distributors taking the 2% cash discount that for early payment, even if they haven't actually paid you net 15, net 30, whatever the agreement is. I would really emphasize the cash payments and the shortages as instances where the distributor puts the burden of proof on you to disprove that these things have happened, right? And even if you're a really small brand, it's worth going after those specific deduction types. I know you may not be able to look at every single type of chargeback that you see, and but honestly, you can get a really large percent repaid on shortages and on these early payment cash discounts. And even if you're a really small brand that feels like you might not have a ton of leverage with the distributors, it's absolutely worth your time looking in those two areas, because those are areas where the distributor will charge, if there's any shadow of a doubt, they're going to put a chargeback and then just leave it to you to sort of fight it after the fact. So, you know, those are the ones that I would highlight. And then later on in this presentation as well, we'll have some slides on some of these specific chargeback types as well.
One thing I'll just high level jump in. Sorry, Adam. Is the audits too? Forgot about those. Essentially, what happens down the road, especially if you've got a promotion going on that maybe you shorted or something like that, is you'll get these audits a year and a half, 2 years later down the road. And something that if you're not organized and you don't have all your ducks in a row as far as, you know, keeping paper backup or electronic backup of all your correspondences, maybe something that you knew you were going to be short on and you let them know about, but they didn't record it internally. And then 2 years down the road, you get a chargeback for it. And they'll say, well, you know, we should have gotten the discount that we ordered on, or something along those lines. And so if you don't keep all your documentation, all your correspondences, down the road when you get an audit, you know, you're not going to be able to fight back on those sort of deductions, when a lot of times, you know, they're not justified, or they're very highly inflated based on, you know, out of stock situations. So that's definitely a common one I see that you can fight back on, and generally, if not get all of them back, you know, you can usually negotiate on those too.
Awesome. And Greg, on that point, remind us of how far back can suppliers go to refute these things, contest with the distributors, versus how far back the distributors will go to, issue those I guess, refute or appeal the payments to brands.
Yeah, I mean, so it's different for each distributor. I believe UNFI, it's 12 months back that you can go to dispute, and KHE, it's 6 months. I know it used to be a few years ago. I think they changed that. It used to be you go back 2 years with UNFI, but I think that's been changed. And as far back as distributors can go, I believe it's in their contracts that it's 2 years for both of them. And when I say 2 years, I know with UNFI specifically, it's like 2 years and change. They can go as long as it's in the second year, like numerical year, it's fine. So even if it's like 2 years and 11 months, it's still, yeah, so.
Right. Yeah. So it's hard to close your books and accrue, not knowing you could still have liability out there from, 2 fiscal years ago as a brand, and all of a sudden, they come knocking for, what hopefully for a lot of you would be smaller money, but occasionally huge. And when they do an audit like this, it can really be a unwelcome, liability that you haven't. Katie, if you can mute yourself. Thank you. Awesome.
Yeah.
So with that, go ahead, Greg. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, and those audits tend to be the largest chargebacks that you receive. They're not only the most unexpected, they're typically the big ones.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think a good segue here, talking about the new unified policy. Greg had a great LinkedIn post, I guess yesterday, part due, as he called it, to some commentary the last month or so, pre and post Expo West, on this new SSA policy, this 2.5% mandate that UNFI is implementing. So, Greg, can you just give the group a little overview on that? And obviously, anyone who wants to learn more can go and read your article. We won't ask you to recite all of that over again, but I do think it's very timely in terms of, whatever's driving it, the implications for emerging brands, and then maybe most importantly, what the brand response can be. And again, probably more to the tone of communication, correspondence, and making sure you're not just sitting on your hands as these things come through.
Yeah, so essentially what happened, just as a little overview on the SSA policy, is that UNFI added this into their policies, which they're able to do. They're able to pretty much add anything to their policies when they want. Their supplier agreement ties directly back to those policies. So they added this in saying, hey, if you're gonna, basically brands need to pay 2.5% in order to get some data transparency, which is including all the supply chain by Clearview reports that they have, and Also, they're going to waive a select number of fees. A lot of those fees were logistics fees, and then there's some activation fees, reactivation fees that they're going to include in that as well. So I think it's really a good thing for the smaller emerging brands. I think that as far as the cost is concerned, it's going to be, great for them. Most brands of those sizes don't mind paying a couple percentage points. The under $1 million brands, you know, the costs associated with it and the level of transparency into their inventory levels and understanding, where they are as far as internally at Unify and avoiding spoilage on inventory that's sitting there, avoiding out of stocks, and being able to see that level of transparency is just a huge bonus. And I think it's a huge bonus for any brand. But once you get into be one of those larger brands, 2.5% can be a pretty sizable chunk of potential trade spend that you could be spending elsewhere. It definitely can take away from what you were planning to use. I have several brands that you're looking at 5, 6, 7x what they were spending before with Unify, just based on that 2.5x, because they're trying to spend as much as they can direct with retailers. Essentially, when you're using trade spend, you want that money to go to the bottom line at the store. You want to actually have it affect increases in sales. And while this data is super nice to have and it will help a lot of brands, it's not something most brands want to be spending a ton of money on when they could be using that money elsewhere. So as far as what brands can do, a lot of brands are raising their prices. They're deciding to add 2.5% and pass that cost on through to the end consumer. And that's not what Unify wants to see necessarily. They don't want the idea that their policy immediately caused a price increase to go through. So if you end up doing that, you could receive some pushback, but more immediately, obviously you can cut back on other trade spend, other marketing programs that you had, were planning to do previously, your ad contracts, your other marketing programs. They've got, they've got web, they've got all sorts of different marketing programs, but essentially if you're having to, everybody's got a set bucket of money kind of put aside for, marketing with Unify, marketing with KE, marketing with whoever they're working with. And, that bucket doesn't get any bigger just because this policy was put into place. It's that money's got to come from somewhere. And now you're kind of being forced to do this. So, you got to pull back in other areas.
Yeah, awesome. Great summary. I think to your point, there's finite amount of trade spend. Each brand should be, I think, very particular with what that trade spend is as you look at your margin structure and what you have allocated in your AOP for trade. Trade should be working trade, hopefully. I think the decision matrix here for brands is how much is that data transparency, that access to reporting worth? And for certain brands, that's going to be worth a lot more of this 2.5% than for other brands who might get that data from other sources or might say, I don't need to know the specific level of what, is being offered in exchange for that 2.5 percentile. So definitely a case by case basis. But I think the idea of working trade versus, paying for data and the other data that you might be paying for from outside sources and how you prioritize that transparency is a key one. So yeah, great overview on SSA. This is certainly something that was a big topic at Expo and is being rolled out currently. So, more to come on that. I think, going into now, maybe for you today, the idea of there's probably, I think we've identified not a premature time to look at trade. Even if you're a $500,000, $1 million brand, you're working in the ecosystem of these larger distributors, you're at least active in, let's say, 1 or 2 DCs. Maybe for a lot of these brands, it's Chino or Moreno Valley, and maybe going up the West Coast. But the idea of what brands can do themselves with, very limited resources. Oftentimes it's a founder or just a couple of, maybe fractional employees and maybe a small broker. Is there a way to really go ahead and contest and keep these organized in a couple hours a week as you're sorting through paperwork versus when you call in outside resources and talk to, partners like Floret and look at how much should I be like focused on this and how much exposure do I have?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam. I think for early brands, right, the number of deductions, the actual number of chargebacks that are coming through might be more controlled, but it's going to have a much larger impact on your day-to-day operations. Especially what we see with very small brands is you might not get paid from UNFI or KHE for 6 to 9 months right off the bat, just because you get hit with 1 or 2 deductions for a couple $1,000s, might be slotting, might be free fills into some of your retail locations. And then that just causes compounding cash flow problems and creates this pattern where brands need to sell more and more product just to get paid out for the first time. And so what we would say is for smaller brands, it's less about trade promotion optimization and some of the interesting things that you get into at scale, but it's definitely about building good best practices in terms of accountability, knowing what everyone on your team should be doing at any given point in time, and just sort of setting that culture across your team, whether it's with your brokers or other, fractional folks that you might be working with. It really is about, you might not have on hand the expertise to know every single deduction code or every, nuance of the policy. But what we would really emphasize for small brands that are trying to get into the game is, keep paper documentation of everything that's going on, every contract that you have, every agreement, every bill of lading, every PO. There's enough tools out there that you can use today in terms of document management and everything else that you should always have these things on hand. Of course, learn what's in your contracts. This is really important and, can drive potentially bigger decisions that you take too, right? It's not just about the chargebacks and deductions, but it's really about knowing what happens in case there's an operational issue with your distributor, or knowing whether you should expand to a new large retailer that might carry a bunch of obligations with it, right? And so that learning what's in your contracts and just getting really solid on those policies, is not the most exciting part of this industry by any means, but it really is table stakes if you want to work with distributors with margins the way that they are today. So I would say learning what's in your contracts. I like number 5 here too, just have a clear business justification for signing on to new programs. Know proactively why you are doing something and what the expected return would be. It's not enough just to say, this is going to get us into 50 additional doors or 100 additional doors. And at times your broker might be incentivized actually to, issue a bunch of free fills or do something like that just to grow the distribution of your product. But all of this comes with a cost. And so, what we would really emphasize for small teams as, what they should be doing even before bringing in any type of external partner is just start to have a culture around looking at these things, understanding why you were billed back, file a dispute if there's any shadow of a doubt. It's the distributor's responsibility then to tell you why you were, charged some amount of money. And then the other one on here I would emphasize is number 6, maintain good relationships with your SRMs and CMs at these distributors. These folks deal with hundreds and hundreds of brands. I promise you, they probably do not have a personal agenda against your brand in particular, if you're one of dozens and dozens of brands that they work with. And really, I think proactively communicating some of these issues that you're having with SRMs, it's not going to work all of the time, but we often find that for smaller brands, it couldn't hurt to at least try to start with a good relationship and see what you could achieve that way. So from a best practices perspective, those are things that I would highlight. We're always happy to talk more about these things during the questions period or offline. But yeah, I mean, for small brands, this is really what it boils down to. You have to understand that this is a fixed cost of doing business with and getting into all these retail locations. And to some extent, it's just a question of whether you've planned and prepared for the contingencies in cases like this.
Awesome. Another thing that occurs to me, guys, as you think about an early brand's evolution and kind of a tiered growth model, is it really supports the pretty common industry logic of, making sure you know where you can grow when, and that you have the cash flow to support that, not just in terms of, consumer marketing and slotting, but also all these other kind of hidden or not so hidden fees, as we're discussing with going into new distribution centers, the 90-day guaranteed sale clauses, again, all the things in the contracts. But the more exposure you have simultaneously with rapid growth at all costs kind of a model, means more of these things are hitting simultaneously. So I think, again, going back to the example earlier of it's so common for early brands to be in this cash paralysis mode, where they're waiting on those payments to come through. The payments are a fraction of what you expected them to be. The more vulnerability that you have with that exposure at one time, meaning you're opening up many new DCs, many new customers simultaneously, that can really compound itself. So again, if there's an idea of, I'm just going to grow in California, I'm just going to grow with the Moreno Valley DC, and then I'm going to go up to Rockland. I mean, I think looking at those things, in a quarterly or 6-month sort of a time phase is super critical, especially if financial bandwidth and cash runway is of concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And stuff like this, what I've shown here, it's really common. You lose a really large chunk of those early checks that, from distributors to all these different costs that you've incurred. So we, from our perspective, we take it extremely seriously. Like the decision to work with a distributor and expand your distribution over time is really, really critical to your business. And over time, what we find is you have to build a good pattern around monitoring this information and making sure that you understand why you're getting hit with certain charges. But over time, it doesn't become worth your time potentially as a founder of a business who maybe has a couple of fractional employees to sit down and just kind of carve out the amount of time that it takes to manage all of these deductions. If you just look at these categories and think about all the cross-functional partners that are involved in validating and understanding these deductions, it really brings in your operations team, it brings in your broker, your salespeople are probably involved to some extent as well, in addition to your finance, AR, or bookkeeping positions. And so from our perspective, we love working with brands, especially that have managed this and built a really great system early on, but it just doesn't become like, beyond a certain point, it may not be worth the very limited amount of time that you have to be, digging into a $5 spoilage charge or even like a $50 slotting charge. And so, we observe that after a certain point, inevitably, either because of how much work there is or just because of how mind-numbing it can really be, brands start looking to external solutions just to make sure that they have a handle on all these chargebacks.
Awesome. Hey, on that point today, that's a great build. So what is a typical dollar cutoff amount to get through, the stack of paperwork? Let's say you're a founder going through the stuff manually by yourself once a month or quarterly. Is it $50? Is it $100? Maybe it varies based on the brand and what your liability is, but what are you seeing in terms of, is it kind of death by 1,000 paper cuts where you need to look at every single dollar, or oftentimes is there like a floor where it's like, yeah, you should probably look at stuff over this amount?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it certainly depends on the type and complexity of the business, but as a good rule of thumb, like the defaults we set in Floret is about $100. Anything above $100, you kind of at least want to know why you were charged for it. And a lot of these smaller charges, a 2% spoilage allowance or something, will probably usually come below that amount if you're a smaller brand. Ultimately, I think it really just comes down to the patience and fastidiousness of the brand owner. One thing I will say is it is probably not worth your time to deep dive into anything below $100, just because the process of potentially disputing it, the amount of time and energy it would take to get that money back, even if you are correct and feel strongly about it, you sort of question whether the juice is worth the squeeze below a certain dollar threshold. And so if I were running a brand, I would say, I want to know why every type of charge exists, but there's probably a threshold below which it's not worth my time to be auditing every single PO, just to make sure that I didn't lose a couple bucks here or there.
Excellent. Yeah, I think another area that on the topic of free fills, slotting, which might seem very cut and dry on the surface, like either you agree to it or you don't. But I think for a lot of brands that are working with brokers that have retail teams out of the market, and you're calling on the onesie twosies, the independent accounts. Reading Tane's next slide here ahead of time. Sorry, but I was just going to say, I'll throw it back to you
Okay.
today. Just that be
Yeah.
conscientious with your broker partners, that you're looking at, the independents, the small guys, and that you're not paying for repeat free fills, whether it's intentional or not. Oftentimes what happens is you'll go into a new account, you're excited, you offer a free fill happily, that account falls out. Let's say the retail person doesn't go back in, the rep, or maybe it's someone even on your own team, and the free fill sells through, it's not reordered, and then 3 months later you get charged for a free fill again to go back into that very same account. I mean, that is completely unacceptable. It should be to everybody. It happens all the time, and again, oftentimes it's just accidental, but it's a lack of organization to know this product sold, I want to order another case, or there's maybe just not a clear person responsible for it, just with how busy a lot of store managers are, and if that rep is not going in there often enough to keep a close eye on things. So just another call out that I've seen increasingly, I think, in the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. I just and yeah, blanket free fills. This is the number one deductions pain point on our list too. Just in terms of where, especially with smaller brands, you can just find yourself leaking money. Depending on what you sell, could be hundreds and hundreds of dollars for you to do a free fill at a certain location of a certain store. So would just highlight that. I think everything else on here has been covered, but I would double down on just making sure to whom you are giving free product and how much, because it's easily the part of this that can just get crazy very quickly. And on the surface, you would say it's great, we're in all these new retail locations and everything's going the way that we would have thought.
Yeah, kind of goes back to the idea that getting on shelf is maybe 20% of the battle, and the velocity selling through, staying in there, is the other 80%, where a lot more of the effort comes in to really see the sales success.
Yeah, absolutely.
Agreed. One thing I'd mention real quick is, even though it is kind of death by 1,000 cuts, Adam, and it feels like you have to look at everything, and but sometimes, like Tanae said, the juice isn't just worth the squeeze. The most important part, even if you can't spend the time on each one of these little teeny deductions, is just understanding what categories they're in, where, if you can categorize every one of these deductions and then add it up at the end, right? And you can understand, okay, that 1,000 cuts was just $10,000 out the door. And even though each one was $50 and you weren't spending a bunch of time on each one, you now have an understanding of, okay, this is an issue, a big issue for the company as a whole. What operationally do we need to do to change that? And, elevating that information to the top, and understanding that is key to making sure you're going to run your business, as effectively in the future. So, and then finding somebody that understands what can be done, what can you do to correct that issue as a whole.
Awesome. Great build. Cool. Well, yeah, with that, tonight, do you want to do a quick demo on kind of high level run through, and unless there's any other builds before we do that?
No, that sounds good to me, right? And so what we built with Floret is a solution that actually reads and categorizes every single piece of deduction backup that you receive. So KHE and UNFI, or among others, like really everybody, even if you work directly with a retailer, are sending you dozens and dozens of these forms every single month. And with Floret, what you get is every single one being read, reading the form and having it get broken down into the exact category. And so we really built this for smaller and emerging brands so that they could get snapshot visibility on a retailer by retailer level, first and foremost, of where this money is going, but also so that they could understand how it breaks down by what we call issue type, right? So at a high level, what you need to know is, how much money is being deducted, in what areas are we losing money, and then you can really game plan and try and understand what the steps are that you can take to make sure that these things can be addressed. So for this is not a real customer. Of course, this is all dummy data, but for this customer, clearly shortages are the biggest issue, and it's something that's really easily solvable. We do free demos where we'll just walk through a customer's last year of deductions for them, and then what we often see is for something like shortages, they might not have the right pattern in place to be disputing these because they're not looking at their bills of lading and POs. They maybe don't know the right language and the right way to take this up with a distributor. And so we'll often also just dispute deductions for brands and we take this on. But if I saw a brand with sort of this profile of deductions, I would say, hey, you can probably claw a bunch of these shortages back. On the merchandising standpoint, these are sort of standardized charges that you agree to with retailers, right? A Whole Foods or a Publix, you agree to maybe a 2 to 3% merchandising charge, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. So this is something that you should really be building into your forecasting. You should assume that some percentage of your revenue associated with these brands is going to be a merchandising charge. And then, there's a question in the chat, right? What percent of gross sales is average or a good target for a new brand for MCB scans and slotting? That's a great question. I can take this while we sort of walk through this, right? So MCB promotions, scans, etc. For mature, like really good brands that have been around for a really long time, we see 10 to 15% sort of a gold standard. But then for early emerging brands, it's very common, unfortunately, 30 plus percent. We don't encourage that. We love to see early brands that are in the 20s because they are really controlled on what accounts they spend on. They have a reason for refills and slotting into new locations, etc. But yeah, the unfortunate reality is, we'll see 30 to 40% for emerging brands, and we won't really blink an eye because we understand that no matter how disciplined you are about the stuff, at some point you just kind of have to swallow to grow into some of these retail locations. There will be months when you are in the 30 plus, 40 plus percent. But if I see an early brand in the high 20s, I usually think that that's pretty good, to shoot for. Early being subjective. Now, looking further down here, stuff like disposition and freight charges as well. These are things that it might be wise to sort of tighten up with your operations team and just make sure that you know why these charges are coming through, so that you can really get a good handle on what needs to be done about these deductions and how these can be eliminated over time. And so all of this data, right, the ability to see it by P&L category, all of this can sync into QuickBooks, and we have NetSuite Sync coming soon as well, to split out invoice fees, and then also to map all of this spending versus your promotional planner. So in Floret, you can actually have your promotional calendar live in the software, and then we can find matches between all of the spending coming off of those MCBs can be automatically tied to all of the promotions that you had authorized at the beginning of a promotional period. And so what we really see brands doing effectively on our platform is starting from a high level trade budget, maybe it's $100,000 or something like that, figuring out exactly which promotions you're going to run, and then seeing the real results come through with our software so that you can start from saying, this is our revenue coming in every month. This is our net and our gross revenue. And then here's a waterfall of where we're losing money and where the opportunities are to dispute or to get money back over time, but also to improve the way that we're operating by running promotions more effectively, disputing, and so on and so forth.
Awesome. Treasure trove of data, guys. This is great. A couple of good questions in the chat. We'll start to move into the Q&A unless you have other stuff you wanted to share today, but I think that was tons of food for thought. I just wanted to add on the idea of what percentage of trade is, reasonable or should be expected. There's a couple other variables in there. I think Tane's point that, early brands, you're building the house. Like the infrastructure is going to cost a lot of money. Like anything, that initial output is just going to be disproportionate to get that momentum, that inertia going with your product lines. So slotting in year one is always going to be heavier. As you're making a P&L, expect year one, the first launch, 12 months or so, especially 6 months into that retailer, is going to be a lot bigger than year two, year three, which is why it's so critical to stay on shelf and see that increased savings as time goes on. The other thing is it somewhat plays into the category. I mean, certain categories just have higher demands and trade and higher expectation that you're going to be promoting more often. I think beverage is a classic one where, if you're competing for end caps and pallet drops and that sort of thing, you're going to have to be dealing down, to make that happen. So again, there's probably not one hard and fast rule, but there are a few key variables. Paige, you have a good question here, two-part question. So I'll try to maybe answer the first part of this and kick it to the Floret guys for the second part. But how do you know when you're ready for UNFI outside of being with an anchor account? Number of stores, velocities. I think it typically happens that you won't have a choice. If you want to go into X retailer, UNFI or KeHE will be that primary distributor, and that's going to be your conduit. They are the point A to point B transportation mechanism to get your product there. And so you won't be able to go direct. It's not an option unless you have some sort of really sophisticated DSD network, in beverage or a snack category potentially. It's going to be just because that is the default mechanism for distribution. So that's probably how you're going to know. Again, the other exception would be if you're only looking at servicing a large anchor retailer in a very limited geography like San Diego County, and you can do it with your own small distribution team, or you're doing your own like van drops directly. You can kind of start and build that way, which I think is a really advisable way to go. But again, it's only a stepping stone to get to a larger point where you would need to open up that DC once you can no longer do the self-distribution model as you go into a larger territory. And then the second part of that question is maybe one for you, Greg. How can you guarantee that any savings that are moving from UNFI will get passed through to the customer, that they're not being pocketed? And I guess there's a few ways to approach that, but maybe has to do with the depth of your deals, I assume.
Yeah, is she saying moving to UNFI? So
Yeah,
from
maybe I can clarify really fast because it's a little confusing. It's actually a real situation I'm looking at, which is I am with a DSD. And first of all, thank you. This is super, super helpful and really interesting. And I know that UNFI, for example, has better rates negotiated with some retailers. And so my question is really, is there a way that I can communicate to the retailer that I'm going to have a lesser price from for example, UNFI versus what they were paying through my current distributor, and make sure that that discounted cost is being appropriately passed on?
Yeah. So yeah, what you're going to basically want to do is chat directly with the retailer. They all have account managers and account specialists internally at UNFI. And if you're not already set up at so if you're already set up at UNFI, they'll be able to see their costs already in the system. All they have to do, if they're a chain, they have to have it added to their approved product list, and then it'll show up internally. And then they'll see exactly what their cost would end up being. If you're not yet in UNFI, then you just have to share with them your cost, and you're not going to get finalized pricing until you get set up, because they have freight rates that they'd have to figure out what would be added to your the cost of landing the product in-house. But that all said, they have pre-negotiated markups with these retailers, and it's UNFI is so big, they're not going to you're going to be able to clearly say to that retailer, this is my cost into UNFI. And either sometimes they'll share with you what their cost is, sometimes they won't. So it's kind of dependent on them, and sometimes you can see it in some of the sales data you get. But there's not going to be any funny business going on internally with the pricing at UNFI by brand, right? It's all very streamlined by they have so many brands that they're dealing with and so many retailers. So I don't know if that helps or answers your question at all, but
yeah, that helps. Thank you.
And Paige, your follow-up, if you're tracking this data, does Floret also measure sales lift from running promotions, et cetera? So kind of a PPA example here.
Yeah, for sure. So our ability to sort of measure and capture this stuff is kind of confined by the amount of sales data that you have, right? We're able to pull in KeHE data as an example from their Supplier Connect portal, UNFI sales data as well from the SVO velocity reports and stuff like that. And so depending on the amount of data access that we have, we can even sort of get your trade spend rates and stuff like that broken out on a pretty granular level, and that's all part of sort of our core software offering. But in terms of like calculating lifts and precise lifts and stuff off of some of these campaigns, it really depends on the completeness of information that we have access to on the platform. This does tend to be pretty comprehensive for what the majority of brands are trying to accomplish, which is trade spend rates, variation in revenue over time, et cetera.
Excellent.
Yeah. And even something that I would be curious about is measuring, especially for emerging brands, being able to tell what actually moves the needle for you so that when you grow from emerging to the next stage, you have sort of a roadmap. So if you know that doing promos with a certain number of demos boost your lift more than just doing a promo, that's kind of something that I'm looking at in my data too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that post-promotional analysis page is super critical. There's a couple different ways to look at that. There are more like robust trade management solution platforms, which you can partner with that measure that stuff in terms of a very like detailed trade way that you put in all your promotions, ahead of time, and then you're looking at performance against those with velocities. You've got to tie out a lot of your data to make sure you can see that if you're using like a third party partner, or maybe you can even do it, by working with your broker, depending on what your contracts are with some of the syndicated data companies and stuff that provide sales data for the retailer in question. So not like a hard and an easy black or white answer there, but there's a few different ways. Cool. I think Greg, you had just mentioned something on the idea of like pickup versus delivery, and maybe this is another good kind of side tangent on just subsidizing freight, for new brands that are setting up with distributors these days. I found in my career that kind of pro and con, it ebbs and flows with, do you want to do FOB or do you want to do delivered, depending on the overall state of affairs and what's happening with gas prices and kind of, I think, macroeconomic factors that you can argue it just depends. And it's hard to switch once you have one locked in. But what are your thoughts on what's benefiting brands these days?
Well, I think brands as a whole, the larger brands are gonna want to do pickup as much as possible, just because it streamlines everything. There's a number of fees that are involved if you don't do pickup and you do delivered. If your truck arrives late, or you have they have a company that they use to actually offload the trucks that you have to pay separately. There's a lot of like small things that ended up adding up. That said, there's something to be said being able to control. If you have a product that's highly perishable, you might want to do delivered because you can control the date that it actually gets to the warehouse. When you have a pickup from a UNFI, it's going across the country, that can take up to 3 weeks to get to the end location, which if you got a perishable product, that's not a great thing. If you got chocolate, that's not a great thing. You want to be able to control the temperature that it's in and all that stuff. So there's a lot of factors that go into that decision. Pricing obviously being one of them. Typically they're going to have better rates than you because they're working off of quite a bit of volume and they're doing a lot of backhauls, which means that the trucks that are going out to deliver product are picking up product from those pickup locations and bring it back, so they can save a lot of money and charge for it. It's definitely a profit center for UNFI to be doing pickup. So they also have pickup minimums, which can be an issue for emerging brands. And if you're just in one location and you're not doing much for business yet, they might not be able to hit their pickup minimums. So you might have to be delivered, and they might push you towards that. So there's just a lot of different factors that come into play before you can kind of make a decision on that. But there's definitely benefits to being, I'd say, like most brands that I work with all like if they're not already at pickup, they want to be at pickup just because of all the fees that are involved with being delivered and potential added costs that brands don't think of when they quote that initial pricing for delivered. And then they realize after the fact that, oh, this is costing us a lot more than we thought it would.
Yeah, in addition to having to manage third-party freight carriers, which puts you in a whole different business that you probably want to be in. So just be careful if you have the bandwidth for that. Again, lots of puts and takes either way. Awesome, guys. Another great question here from Carmen. Have you seen emerging brands really effectively negotiate? I'll just say with distributors, I guess UNFI in this case, but this is going to apply everywhere during the contract phase. Any tips on how to negotiate that?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen. I mean, it all depends on how much leverage you have with that specific distributor that you're working with, and if you're working with a smaller distributor, obviously you can have more leverage if you've got existing accounts that you're bringing to them. That's a big deal to them. So usually you can be they can be a lot more nimble on their contracts, and B, they can that leverage can really those extra sales really mean a lot to them. And if they're a sensitive customer that you're bringing to them, that could be, you know, of huge value. For the bigger distributors, called the big two in the natural space, you know, it's a lot harder to be able to get that sort of leverage. Usually that leverage only comes when, hey, you just got launched nationally with Whole Foods, or you just got launched nationally with Sprouts or Albertsons, right? Like that's the way that you get leverage with those guys. And even then, depending on who your supplier manager is, they all have different, or category manager, they all have different views on where they're going to bend and where they aren't. So it's hard for me to say, you know, that, depending on all those factors, you know, how successful you're going to be. But the biggest chance you have at success is if you're accepted and being pushed through by a retailer that's sensitive to that particular distributor. That's where you're going to have the most leverage. Or the unicorn case where, you know, you decided never to go through distributors and have a ton of direct business and are actually moving direct business to distribution, which doesn't happen very often, but I have seen it before. If there's existing sales there that you can bring them, if you can bring them a couple $1 million in sales that they didn't have incrementally, you know, that's a pretty big deal too. So, but there are key spots in the contracts where you can negotiate that they do have. Like I was a supplier manager at one of these distributors, and you know, when going through training, they literally highlight all the things that you're allowed to negotiate on. So there are certain spots in those contracts that you can make changes to.
That's awesome, Greg, leaving us with a glimmer of hope. I like the positivity. Thanks for that. That's probably a welcome message at this point here and towards the end of the call. I think keying off of that, Greg, as you mentioned a former SRM, this idea of relationship building and just, people skills, and obviously it can probably be a relentless job looking at it from the inside out if you're managing 100, give or take, plus emerging brands as an SRM and, whatever category. I think oftentimes there's the sense of like, there's just a brick wall of like, they don't want to work with me. And man, I'm trying to get through to get this DC opened up. And they're telling me I need to have now 50, stores ready and waiting. It used to be 25, before the pandemic. All that stuff's out there a lot right now. What are those other kind of, I guess, maybe soft skills or just interpersonal things that brands can do to try to, ingratiate themselves, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, at the end of the day, you're dealing with people that all have, different mentalities in life, they're different, different things they're interested in. When I was at UNFI, there were just a number of times you would deal with really difficult brands and really great brands. Like, and it didn't matter, what the situation was. That was just the way they were. And obviously, when you're dealing with people, they're going to respond to the people that they like better, that they respond better to. It's just the reality. If you're always just coming to them for difficult situations, you're probably not going to get responses back. If you're coming to them, with situations that are exciting, or you're bringing them something that they need to do better in their job, obviously you're going to end up getting responses from them quicker. You're going to get favors from them more. There are things, certainly when brands come and, say I had a baby, right? I had brands send me onesies, like with their brand on it, like little things like that, like, have some swag available as a brand that you can send to your supplier category managers. Try to build that relationship when you don't need anything in back from them. Try to show that, you are a real human being, and, you can be a fun, get along, amiable person that isn't going to be a pain in their butt. Because the last thing when they're dealing with 200 brands is dealing with a founder that thinks the only thing of importance is their, $200,000 brand, when that supplier manager is literally handling a desk worth 250 million. Like, it's just, even though it's important to you, and that's understandable, they've got, a lot of pressure every day. And, you got to kind of take that into account when you're dealing with them.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's still a people business despite everything. I think that goes a long way. Most SRMs tend to like samples. Hopefully they like your product. I think they're still allowed to receive samples. It's not considered bribery like it is with a lot of retail buyers. So definitely offer those up. And yeah, I call them kind of winning the tiebreakers. Like just try to stand out, be good people, and don't be on that naughty list, per se. So awesome. Great advice, guys. We're at time, but if there's any other questions, Kirsten, you got a comment here if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I was just gonna say in other forums that Adam has specifically done around sales, that has often been a point, specifically with retailers. They love your brand swag, so print extra hats, give them around, like just hats, shirts, all of that. I just wanted to emphasize what Greg had said, because that has come up time and time again. And it's, it can be simple as a t-shirt or whatever, but it goes a long way.
Hey,
Definitely.
if my kids love your brand, I have to love your brand. I have no other choice. So you send them hats, you send them, t-shirts, that goes a long way in my book. So, and a lot of people are like that. A lot of like little things. Try to find a connection with your, category manager any way you can that you can build off from.
Yeah, and I think even additionally important now is like a lot of times the SRMs, and the other client managers aren't getting out much from home. They're typically working remotely. They don't get to go to the trade shows, so you're not even seeing the client teams at the tabletop shows because they're sending their retail focused customer manager teams. So yeah, I can't speak for it. I haven't been in the role, but I imagine it can be a little bit lonely sitting wherever you are. And at least for me, it's like I thrive on that energy when you're out at the industry events, and a lot of times that's more few and far between than it used to be. So all the more important. But hey, thanks, guys. We'll wrap it up with that. I know people have to jump here at the hour, but this has been just treasure trove of knowledge. We covered a ton here. Hopefully it was of high value for many of you. If you guys want to drop your emails in the chat before everyone jumps, Greg, today, feel free to do that. Otherwise people can reach out if they have interest. I would just say that this is not a sales pitch by any means for Floret. It's not a sales pitch at all for going to an external deductions or trade management partner. More so, I think just a reminder to keep your arms around it as long as you can yourself, and realize that if there's a point where you need external resources, it's always kind of that decision of when do you outsource and hire versus keeping things that you can do yourself. And there's this usual breaking point where it's like, I can pay a little bit for this. I know exponentially it's going to pay for itself and what's coming back to me. And there's a better way of doing this, a more efficient way than me spending hours and hours diving through things. And that can apply to sales. It can apply to marketing. It can apply, it has to do with when you hire brokers. The same, I think, decisions apply, just in different facets of the business. So awesome. Any final comments today, Greg? Go ahead. Otherwise, we'll say goodbye.
No,
I'll just say, yeah, we're rooting for all of you. We love small and emerging brands. And if we can be helpful, please feel free to reach out.
Yeah. Thanks for having us on, Adam. It's great.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone, for participating. These are awesome, really important. We love the feedback as well. So thanks so much. Hopefully we'll see a lot of you at Pitch Slam next week.